Okay, good morning. I am pleased to be joined today by Max Abrams, who's an associate professor I'm sorry, what is your official title? It's associate professor of international relations at Northwestern or Northeastern University. Oh my God.
Yeah, I'm a political scientist and a professor in the political science department at Northeastern and also in the School of Public Policy.
Okay, very good. And the reason that you've come across my radar in recent months is because you always have a very perceptive take, I think, on foreign policy matters, especially during the election. You were calling attention, I think, more than most probably to the potential dangers of a Hillary Clinton presidency in the foreign policy realm. And, just in broad strokes, I'm wondering, given that Trump has now been in office for a little over a month, do any of the worries that you had with regard to what a Hillary Clinton presidency might have portended, or does any of the cautious optimism that you expressed about the potential upsides of a Trump foreign policy have they been borne out at all over the past month? Is it too early to tell, or what is your current perception of that?
Sure. I mean, the truth is that I'm not a big political advocate. I tend to be a political critic. And I was one of the many, many people who just assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win, that she would be our next president. And so, partly because of that expectation, most of my foreign policy focus was on her. And my specialization is terrorism and counterterrorism. And on that score, I believe that Hillary Clinton would have been very bad. Her policy ideas, simply from that perspective alone, and I come from a family of Democrats, so there are many other issues where I agree with her, social issues, for instance. But just in terms of terrorism and counterterrorism, she scared me. And her policy positions are pretty well known to those who actually, follow things and aren't just reflexively pro Hillary Clinton. But basically, I actually supported the Iraq War in part because of her advocacy for it. A lot of people don't understand this today. They seem to get that Hillary Clinton, quote unquote, supported the Iraq War, but Hillary Clinton was probably the biggest advocate of the Iraq War within the Democratic Party. And because I came from a family of Democrats, for me, it wasn't enough that George W. Bush supported the war. What really got me to support it was people who historically I would have trusted even more. So leadership within the Democratic Party, the Brookings Institute, which at the time certainly was described as sort of left center. They were very, very enthusiastic about the war. In particular, I worked as a fellow at that time at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And I can tell you that Ken Pollock's support for the war was very, very influential among sort of young pundits in DC at the time. And in any event, I ended up supporting the Iraq War, and I quickly discovered, as did Trump, I should point out, very, very early on, that pretty much all of the core predictions turned out to be untrue. And that, of course, it created a power vacuum, which was filled up by an Al-Qaeda affiliate that wasn't really in play there before regime change. And then I saw Hillary Clinton's basically, again, leadership, not just limited support, but leadership in terms of regime change in Libya, which is sort of an undertold story from a counterterrorism perspective. It ended up not only destroying that country by basically every numerical data indicator you can find, but also actually contributed to the conflict in Syria by basically spreading weapons and militants all over the North Africa, Middle East region. And then again, I saw her leadership in terms of regime change in Syria and her advocacy for supporting the rebels, basically over promising what they could do in terms of their moderation, in terms of their strength, supporting a no-fly zone in Syria, which essentially is a pro-regime change position because it would have basically negated Syrian air power and Russian air power. And I watched basically our inability to actually locate these moderate rebels, and basically her advocacy for the rebels, which ended up greatly exacerbating the conflict by prolonging the war in Syria. Basically, political scientists have found that civil wars tend to end not with power sharing agreements, not by basically building up the weaker side to make it, of rough parity with the government, but rather when one side is able to exhibit military dominance. And so her efforts to continuously feed the weaker side in Syria, that policy position helped to extend the war by years. And so now we're seeing a reduction in external support for the rebels, and consequently, the picture in Syria is getting much better. And so basically, on these three core issues, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, I was very unimpressed with Hillary Clinton. And in all of those conflicts, Trump actually fared better than she did. Although, in a Howard Stern show, he said, quote unquote, yeah, I guess so. In terms of whether he supported the Iraq war, please find me a single person who was persuaded to support the Iraq war because of Donald Trump's appearance on Howard Stern.
No, and that was so frustrating to me at the time. I mean, people were trying to assert some kind of parity between Trump's advocacy for the Iraq war and Hillary Clinton's. When Hillary Clinton was the senator from New York, which had just been attacked on 9/11, she was going to the floor of the Senate, issuing emotional declarations of support in favor of the war. She was probably among the most central, if not the most central, people in the entire nation, literally, in facilitating the onset of the Iraq war, because she was able to, like you mentioned, persuade Democrats that George W. Bush would never been able to communicate to effectively.
Yeah, and also she was one of those people who conflated 9/11 with the Iraq war. She would say sometimes in passing, don't get me wrong, 9/11 wasn't committed by, Iraqis. But she would say things like, coming from New York, I certainly appreciate the perils after 9/11 of inaction, and therefore we need regime change in Iraq. So she was one of those people, part of the misinformation campaign, linking those two events.
Yeah, and this is sort of water under the bridge now, but that spiel you just gave was essentially what I would give when people would badger me as to why I thought it was untenable in an ethical sense to support somebody who was so central in facilitating the worst foreign policy calamity in the country's recent history. She wasn't just an ancillary figure. She was absolutely central to it. And then she waged the entire 2008 campaign, ending that the veracity of that vote against the criticisms of Barack Obama. And she didn't formally renounce it until 2014.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, she's an ideologue. She's really not an empiricist. She was just clinging to this idea. Where I disagree with you, I guess, is that it's not water under the bridge, because her foreign policy ideas are still very much alive. I would say she's still very much part of the dominant paradigm in DC, or what's sometimes called now the blob.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so she learned. It's not clear that she really learned anything, and that the DC community learned anything. And so again, we're seeing continued clamoring for moving removing dictatorial regimes, and basically a failure to really understand the militants on the ground who will replace these governments. And I expect to see more of the same, precisely because the blob is an ideological entity. There's no updating their beliefs based on what actually happens around the world.
Yeah, it's water under the bridge only insofar as it was pertinent to the debate specific to the election. But obviously, it still continues to be relevant now, not because of the personage of Hillary Clinton. Obviously, her influence has waned somewhat, thankfully. Yeah. It matters because she was an emblem or a stand-in for the mentality of the foreign policy establishment, which continues to exert its influence and exert its and demand that its priorities be enforced now. Contrary to all the empirical data, like you mentioned, and they can, and they now the irony is that they're doing that sort of in opposition to Trump, at least in some facets.
There's basically no accountability in terms of foreign policy advocacy. You basically have the exact same entities, the same think tanks that are called upon by mainstream media to answer questions, really despite their continuously abysmal record on getting just the most basic facts about core Middle East policies correct.
Yeah, and some of those same organizations that you mentioned, which were integral in advocating for the Iraq War, are now advocating a Syria strategy, or were in the orbit of the Hillary Clinton Syria strategy, which hasn't just been a failure; it's been an absolutely calamitous failure insofar as it's helped or contributed to the production of this refugee crisis. And you've now co-authored a paper on that very topic. What is the culpability of the same foreign policy establishment that Hillary was enmeshed in contributing to that eventuality?
Well, I think it was huge. I really think that without the external support for whatever you want to call it, the Syrian opposition or the rebels, there never would have been a civil war like this. I'm pretty sure that Assad would have, put out the flames. I mean, obviously in a very illiberal way. He would, tortured people, killed people, done absolutely heinous things that are reprehensible. But from a utilitarian perspective, the country is much worse off because of all of the external support, including the U.S. support. And so part of basically the way the refugee problem is described in the West is that Syrian refugees or that's the Syrian population rather is essentially being represented by the Syrian rebels, and that Assad is against the rebels and therefore against the population, and that citizens across the country have been fleeing because it's sort of like a one-sided genocidal campaign. And so the Syrian citizens are rational because they don't want to be in prison, they don't want to be tortured, they don't want to be killed. So I've been part of a team of researchers who deployed basically in all the countries relevant to the Syrian refugees making their way from Syria into the Balkans. I think we had researchers put in place in about 12 countries over the course of at least a year, developing really strong relationships on the ground, and going to migration centers, and just they were all fluent in Arabic or had translators. And one of the things that we asked is, who are you fleeing from? Why are you leaving Syria? And what we expected to find, certainly based on what I have read in the media, is that they were fleeing from Assad. And yet we basically gave them a number of options. They could blame Assad. They could blame, I think we called it the armed opposition, or they could blame both. And what we found is that in every single country where we did these surveys, the vast majority blamed not just Assad, but rather blamed both Assad as well as the rebels. And in the studies that we have, which are under review, it's not just like a simple questionnaire where we got their quick answer. We had researchers speak to them for hours. And so we have many very in-depth stories about why exactly they registered their opinion as fleeing both the government and opposition. And they describe stories, for example, of being in Aleppo and not actually liking the rebels at all, and essentially having their city being taken over. And then, like a young girl, I remember in one of the interviews, she was afraid of the rebels, and then the government started bombing the rebels, and so she was afraid of the government too. And the rebels were also indiscriminately shelling. And so this is a good example of somebody who is afraid of both Assad and the rebels. There were also a number of cases, and I didn't know this until we did the interviews, where Syrians actually had been imprisoned by both sides. They were, for example, initially imprisoned by Nusra, and then the government, upon being released, the government was afraid that maybe they were pro-Nusra because they had spent time with Nusra, and so the government would then imprison that person. So in a number of cases, these Syrians have been imprisoned multiple times by both the government as well as the opposition. We spoke to people in the Deir ez-Zor area, which basically has gone back and forth between the Syrian military and Islamic State. And people fled from there fearing both. And so they were happier when the government took over areas, but they still didn't feel safe, and so they fled. So basically, the culpability in Syria, it's been very, very one-sided. If you read the Washington Post or CNN, that sort of class of violence, the way it's described, is a one-sided genocide, but really it's a civil war with belligerents on all over the place, and basically the citizens are caught in between. And so,
can I interject just quickly, just a question for clarity's sake? In as much as you're able to generalize, and obviously there are going to be distinctions in the stories of one person versus another, but to the extent that you're able to generalize, when a person asserts that he or she believes that both sides, quote unquote, are deserving of blame, do they express a preference as to who they would prefer to be in power? So you can have a negative opinion of Assad and a negative opinion of the rebels or opposition, but you can state that all things being considered, you'd prefer to have Assad in power, right, just because it would be less bad. Right. Is that something that was expressed? Yeah, often?
Definitely. I mean, some people said that they were imprisoned by both Assad and Nusra, and that basically the Nusra prison was worse. That they were mistreated even more. That all of their possessions were stolen. So yeah, it would be misleading if basically they apportioned 90% of the blame to Assad, but some to the rebels. No, we spoke to many people who basically think that Assad is less responsible for their plight than the armed opposition, and that makes sense. I mean, when you look at the actual layout in terms of the demographics of the country, a huge portion are in the population center around the Damascus area, and they tend to be ignored, right? In the same way that Aleppo was basically divided in two, and the media didn't focus much on the government side; they only focused on the rebel side. And so, I do not think that Trump is an intellectual by any means, but some of his policy positions have really resonated with me more than, say, the alternative of Hillary Clinton. I honestly, based on listening to Trump and Hillary, it seems almost as if Trump understands what I'm saying better, because he would say things like, I don't really want to support any of these guys. We don't really know who they are. Like, the whole lot of them is bad.
Some cynical people will take what you just said and construe it as somehow a defense of Trump or an expression of support of Trump. But really, what it should be taken as is an indictment of prevailing foreign policy orthodoxy, which regards what you just articulated there as somehow outside the mainstream when it seems just extremely straightforward. Trump, to the extent that we have any kind of grasp of what his strategy in Syria will be. There have been a few leaks this past week about the broad contours of his anti-ISIS strategy, and it, in large part, seems to be basically just a continuation of Obama's anti-ISIS strategy,
Right.
notwithstanding Trump's bluster. The main difference being that Trump is less inclined to send armaments and weaponry to these so-called rebels. So.
Yeah, I think that the coverage of the foreign policy during the election was really clumsy. And basically, Hillary Clinton wanted to make it seem as if she was a continuation of Obama. And in reality, I'm a much bigger supporter of Obama than I am of Hillary Clinton. I view them as very, very different when it comes to counterterrorism, when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to dealing with Russia, for example. And so even though I was very critical of Hillary Clinton, I wasn't actually that critical of Obama, at least in the end. Obama had a real evolution in his approach to the Middle East and to Syria in particular. The first few years were not good because he was a much bigger proponent of regime change. He was partly responsible in a way for the spreading of Islamic State. Even we were really late to get there. We were part of this effort to support the opposition without really paying attention where these arms were going. But over time, he realized that we weren't finding these rebels, and that maybe it would be better, especially based on the disaster of Libya, to keep Assad in power. And so the fact that Trump seems to be basically continuing Obama's approach in Syria as he left it, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, and just as a side note, we will link to that paper in the description box of this video so people can go look at it themselves. But another irony is that, if anything, Obama more aligned with Trump, at least with respect to Russia policy and Syria policy. But you never would have known that given the prevailing kind of media narrative in terms of how the race was framed. But Obama attempted to align with Russia, who is now our hardened enemy, supposedly. He tried to forge military alliances with them in Syria. He bucked demands from this blob or foreign policy community to take a more aggressive stance against Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. So there was a lot. So Obama was a lot more in accord with Trump than Clinton, at least in certain foreign policy areas, and that was very seldom acknowledged during the campaign.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, in political science, we might say that both, in my opinion at least, both Trump and Obama are more realist. And, and Hillary Clinton is more from sort of the neoconservative tradition where, she believes in, democracy promotion and regime change. So, yeah, I agree with you. I see a lot of continuity in Syria with Obama, and that doesn't surprise me based on my understanding of what Obama's approach was and basically what Trump campaigned on.
Yeah, and just on the Russia point, so you've now outlined what I think is a representation that is in accord with other representations I've seen, which is large swaths of the Syrian population, although they don't have any necessary affinity for Assad, they find his reign as a preferable outcome to the reign of these jihadi gangs, essentially. Is very similar to what Rania Khalek has reported, and she quoted you in an alternate recently. So that you have the Russian intervention in Syria was done at the behest of the Assad regime, and obviously a significant portion of the Syrian population would have welcomed that, and yet Russia's intervention was portrayed in American media as like almost genocidal, as just inherently evil.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one
go
thing
ahead.
that Americans don't really understand is that the Russians are really, really, really into counterterrorism. I mean, you might, you could say America's really into counterterrorism too, but I would say that the Russians are even more so. And basically, Russia today has become a dirty word. And honestly, Americans would understand the conflict in Syria so much better had they watched a little bit of Russia today and not just demonized it. You compare, you compare what's said on Russia today, and a lot of it is nonsense. But it must be understood that a lot of what's said on CNN is also nonsense too. And basically, the prevailing view in the West was that Russia would not get involved in Syria because it didn't want to get bogged down like it did in Afghanistan, with the Red Army and the Mujahideen, and that if Russia were to come into Syria, it would risk getting bogged down because it's not sophisticated at counterinsurgency. And then people like Michael Weiss would say that, Russia is Islamic State's Air Force. That's a direct quote. That Russia doesn't attack Islamic State. Clarissa Ward went on CNN. I watched a full special about her coverage on the ground where she was asked point blank whether Russia also attacks the terrorists, and she said no. It's only the rubble that she was pointing to, the civilians. And Russia is too indiscriminate in its target selection. Russia does have blood on its hands. Russia takes shots and risks that the United States never would, and I'm glad that we don't. However, it's highly misleading to say that Russia hasn't been going after the terrorists in Syria in two ways. First of all, Russia's engagement with Islamic State has been much more severe, much more important in terms of turning the tide against Islamic State than has been reported in the West. And furthermore, Russia's understanding of who the terrorists are in Syria is in some ways much more reasonable than is often portrayed. Russia basically has been a fan of expanding our target selection to include groups beyond Islamic State, other sort of dangerous militant Salafist groups like Nusra. And so I've been in favor of expanding the target selection as well. And so when Russia went after groups that I deemed as certainly terroristic, it was often described as going after the moderate rebels, but really the problem was just that they weren't that moderate. And so I've been much more sympathetic to Russia's military engagement in Syria, and I think that Russia deserves more credit for helping to turn the tide against Islamic State, just in a number of ways. I mean, for one reason, Russia was quite good about going after Islamic State's oil infrastructure. And Islamic State really thrived because of its wealth coming from the oil. And furthermore, you'll remember that Turkey shot down that Russian plane, and Russia was really, really pissed off. And one of the ways that Russia got back at Turkey was by basically shining a bright light on how Turkey was facilitating Islamic State in Syria. And so Russia was really relentless at basically calling out Turkey. And I think that partly as a result of that pressure, Turkey closed down its borders and stopped allowing jihadists, to go from other places in the world through Turkey into Syria, as well as helping to prevent some of the oil sales going out. And so in this way, Russia was helpful in terms of depleting the human capital as well as the financial resources of Islamic State, totally uncovered in the Western media, but covered often in Russia on Russia Today. But that's a swear word that nobody's allowed to watch.
And here's an amazing irony. So Trump's supposed favorable attitude toward Russia and or Putin is constantly depicted in the U.S. media as this profound mystery. There's probably some sinister motivation that's being hidden as to why he has this, strange affinity for Russia. But you just outlined the strategy that Russia has embarked on to curtail the spread of Islamic State, and that's pretty compatible with what Trump has advocated all along as to how he wants would want to combat the Islamic State, namely the idea that their oil resources should be targeted. Trump would always express that position in rather crude terms, saying we should bomb the oil and take the oil or something sort of silly like that. But in practice, it seems to be simply just he was advocating a replication of what Russia apparently effectively implemented to stymie the advance of ISIS, and yet Trump's eagerness to forge a partnership with the power doing that counterterrorism work is constantly depicted in U.S. media as this sort of nefarious, inexplicable, almost conspiracy.
Another point that I want to add is that in general, in international relations, when an international actor, whether they're a government or whether they're a non-state actor, when they attack civilian targets, it's very often because they're weak militarily and they lack the capability. They don't have the same, smart bombs. They don't have the same intelligence, which also requires resources. And so really from the outset of the Syrian conflict, I've been saying that, the U.S. should team up with Assad and then Putin. And some people see that, they attack that and say, oh, that must mean that you're like an apologist, for these regimes. But actually, if the U.S. had gone in and helped these sides out, their side would have been much stronger. And it would have actually improved their conduct. Because the reality is we don't know, exactly which targets the Syrian, Air Force wants to hit, because it can't hit them even if it wants to. That's why it's, drop these barrel bombs. So I think that the U.S. in strengthening the positions of Syria and Russia actually would have made their targeting abilities much more in line with the positions of the American public, which is that we should go after the terrorists very selectively and not harm the population.
And not only are you accused of being an apologist for Assad and Russia when you advocate that position, you're accused of being an apologist or enabler of Trump, which in a domestic context is almost as damning, at least in certain precincts. So that's just always the elephant in the room. Are you saying something or advocating a position which could be construed as somehow supportive of Trump, and that can just get you run out of town, depending on what context you're in, whether it's media or academia or something. So the climate is just really toxic, and you always have to be parsing your words exceedingly carefully so as not to be misinterpreted as as supporting Trump, and it's almost getting tiresome.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I mean, I like to point out that I did not vote for Trump, and that I disagree with him on a host of, really important areas. But I mean, especially I live in Boston and I'm an academic, and I mean, I don't know if there are any Boston academics who are Trump fans, but in a way, I think I'm like you in the sense that I'm contrarian. I'm contrarian. It's not so much that I like Trump, it's that I dislike the Trump haters. And so there aren't that many people who basically try to defend any of his policies. And so when I try to defend any of them, I get attacked as being, some kind of a Trump supporter or an Assadist. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, and it's not as if what bothers me is not Trump hate per se. It's lazy and reflexive Trump hate for its own sake.
Yeah,
That just seems unreflective and just kind of based on personal animus toward Trump as a figure rather than any serious consideration of what policies he's trying to implement or what he actually represents. So that's what more bothers me. I'm often accused of contrarianism,
yeah,
but contrarianism to me connotes something sort of arbitrary where you're just taking a position because it happens to diverge from somebody else's. But I don't
right.
think, at least for me, I don't think that necessarily, reflects what I'm coming at, where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from is just trying to pierce through at least some of this sort of just knee-jerk, lazy thinking that I see pervading so much of the political discussion.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also, I mean, these issues are just really complicated. And so there are pros and cons. There are all sorts of cross-cutting effects with these various policies. And so the media doesn't do a good job of capturing these nuances. They basically just say categorically, anything Trump does is counterproductive. It may, in the aggregate, be counterproductive. Who knows? But there is at least some argument that could be made in defense of some of these policies. You know, I'll bring up sort of a big controversial issue that I'm interested in, that a lot of us are in, and that is the travel ban, for example. This is a really
I was just going to bring
complicated.
that up, by the way, so good timing.
This is a really complicated issue. I think that the coverage on this has been, quite weak. If I were the president, and here's my disclaimer, I would not put into place this kind of a travel ban. This is not my idea. I wouldn't do it. However, I do think that coverage of it has also been unfair. For example, it's described as a Muslim ban, and I mean, this is sort of an ignorant thing to say because the countries with the most Muslims in them are not on the list of banned countries. This is basically, people often confound Arabs and Muslims, and this is more of sort of like an Arab ban, if you will. It doesn't involve, Bangladesh or Indonesia or India or Nigeria, etc.
Yeah, and just to weigh in briefly on that, I don't think it matters all that much what you term it. I think just on its own merits, like you suggested, the policy is wrongheaded. But this constant semantic debate, or whether it's a travel ban or a Muslim ban, I don't think it's terribly useful to get mired in. So that's just my position on the terminology, at least.
Another thing I wanted to raise related to this is another thing that we looked at in the Syria study was how well vetted the Syrian refugees are getting into Europe. And that's probably our most striking finding, is that they're not vetted at all, really. And so we basically found that Syrians don't even need paperwork to get into the EU. That there are plenty of smugglers who would like to take them out. That they get through with the smugglers on their first try. And that really the only limitation for getting out of Syria has nothing to do with their level of radicalization, but their money. So if you have enough money to pay the smugglers, you get through. And so the fact that
But just to be abundantly clear, sorry to interrupt, but to be abundantly clear, the vetting for Syrian refugees is non-existent with respect to their entry into, say, the Balkans or other EU states. This has nothing to do with the United States.
Yeah, that is very much true. It's a very different story getting into the United States. We do much more vetting. For example, going through Greece, at some points they've had like 10,000 people a day going through, and they have no idea who they are. But although there are important differences in vetting, the fact that we saw how easy it is for radicals in Syria and also in Iraq to get into Europe does suggest to me that this whole topic of vetting needs to be taken very, very seriously.
At the very least, there are concerns that should be addressed head on rather than just dismissed out of hand as inherently bigoted. Maybe there's obviously a bigoted element to this demand for vetting, but you should at least address people's concerns in a clear-headed fashion rather than just being, kind of smugly dismissive of them. And I should just note that, I did a segment where I went and interviewed some Iraqi refugees in Orange County, California, who definitely were victimized by the ban, at least because it was so rashly implemented. It just came overnight. There were certain people who had been through a vigorous vetting process who were just suddenly left out and hanging out to dry. So there were vulnerable populations that were harmed by the ban, at least in its initial incarnation. So I think that's worth noting. But some of the logic which underlied the ban, even if you disagree with it, I think it should at least be rebutted in a rational fashion. So
I'm going to take a stab at this, but I actually think that there is some strategic basis, sort of an intellectual basis for Trump's counterterrorism approach. Basically there are two main schools of thought among political scientists about why terrorists arise. One might be understood as the grievance model, which, as the name suggests, is that terrorists are basically responding to grievances. And so if we get rid of grievances, there will be fewer terrorists. And the other school of thought might be understood as the opportunity model, which basically posits that terrorists thrive in conditions which are more sort of propitious for them to meet other terrorists and to mount operations, right? And I basically think that Trump, although he doesn't know it, sort of comes from the opportunity model of terrorism. So he's not that worried about offending Muslims. He's more worried about depriving them the actual ability to plan attacks and to commit attacks. And so we see this both domestically and internationally. So, for example, when Donald Trump does not support regime change, when he supports dictators, he knows that creates grievances. But he's even more worried about removing those dictators because then that would create a power vacuum where the terrorists would have more opportunity and thrive. And I think that the travel ban is complicated because in a way, it might be defended in terms of the opportunity model of terrorism. Basically, we're going to deprive even potential radicals of even getting into the country. And then when people ask, well, yes, but won't that be counterproductive by basically exacerbating Muslim grievances? What Trump will say is basically he's not that worried about the grievances that those who are already have like big grievances against the United States. And
the big contradiction there is that people who proclaim to be worried about the exacerbation of grievances don't tend to be quite so outraged when bombings or arming of rebels or material support to dictators in years past has exacerbated those grievances. So it seems like there's not a consistency there in the how they apportion their supposed worry.
Oh, there's completely selective outrage. I mean, it usually has to do with whether the blob can sell their outrage as like facilitating their goal to oppose Iran. In countries where Iran has no involvement, the blob generally doesn't really care. I mean, like look at like South Sudan, for example. I don't see that much concern about the humanitarian disaster there. So yeah, there's clearly selective outrage, which is used for their own sort of geopolitical goals.
Yeah, I mean, so per this opportunity model of terrorism, is there really an argument that a ban grounded in nationality would be the ideal way of implementing that? I mean, um,
No,
right, yeah,
the ban is not the ideal way of implementing anything. But all that I'm saying is that, it's been sort of categorically dismissed as idiotic. And what I'm saying is that in general, it's not something that I would support, but still we can understand it in terms of these different models. And what it suggests is that the ban, although perhaps in the aggregate is bad, probably does have cross-cutting effects. And that for all we know, some terrorists under the ban would be deprived entry. That is a possibility that, I mean, we should at least consider.
right. During the campaign, I'm reminded now of Trump on occasion calling attention to Hillary Clinton's ties to the Saudis or to the Gulf states. And when the ban was handed down, when was that? July 27th, I think, or sorry, January 27th. It was quickly pointed out by me and others that mysteriously Saudi Arabia did not appear on the list.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any legitimate, rational basis for that, or is that just a product of a capitulation to these vested interests that the American foreign policy establishment tends to have vis-a-vis the Gulf states?
The criteria for being one of the initial 7 countries on the banned list, they were not well articulated. I guess they were, basically taken from an Obama list pertaining to, something else, that wasn't directly related to taking in refugees. So, as a political scientist, I would definitely, when I create some sort of a sample, I'm very clear, or I try to be clear about, why, certain ends fall into my large N group. So what I would have said, I would have done something like, if I wanted to go ahead with this ban, I would have said, okay, it's countries that meet a certain threshold in terms of the amount of terrorism. It's countries that maybe export terrorism, and it's countries where we really can't vet them because of some sort of objective indicator of chaos going on in that country. So one of the problems, with the ban is that you have together all these different countries, some of which are really quite not alike. We're dealing with not like units. For example, Iran is on the list. And Iran, of course, is Shia. And although it's an unpopular country, it's not a failed state. And Sudan, is really not a big terrorism worry compared to some of the other countries. And other countries not on the list are a much bigger terrorism worry, like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And so because the administration wasn't clear about their criteria, it seems very arbitrary, or even worse, possibly anti-Muslim.
Yeah, and I think that was a big issue that people had with the ban, at least in its initial version, was that you had a conflation of unlike countries and the only similarity that people could at least discern initially was that they were predominantly Muslims. That I think somewhat reasonably led people to conclude that it was a Muslim ban, because what else does Iran have in common with Somalia?
Right.
So.
And also, it has to do with the origins of the ban, because at first it started off, at least rhetorically, as a Muslim ban. And according to a story, maybe you've seen this, I think you've read everything in the news, that Giuliani said that they essentially wanted a Muslim ban, but told Trump that in practice it wasn't feasible, and so they had to create this 7-nation ban. If it weren't for that sort of prehistory to the ban, I think that Trump would be able to make a much stronger argument on the basis of national security.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, okay, we've been going for about an hour now.
Yeah, I'm good. My computer is getting low.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
Um, No, not really.
Okay, well, yeah. Well, my final thought is I'm very appreciative that somebody like you exists and is able to take these issues head on without kind of lapsing into the hysterical overdrive that we see so frequently nowadays. Because people are really distrusting the media now, and I guess academia is sort of an ancillary field in the minds of a lot of ordinary Americans. So for opposition to Trump to be effective, it has to be, I think, discerning and rational, and you're somebody who I think embodies that. So that's my concluding thought.
That's cool. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it's a very lonely place. It's easier just to, join, in the just saying every single thing that Trump does is completely idiotic. I try as much as possible to be an empiricist, and I also try to bring in some of these theories from political science to try to maybe shed some light on contemporary issues. And I don't know, sometimes it works and sometimes less so.
Yeah, actually, final question, just out of curiosity. I mean, have you personally encountered resistance from colleagues, or has there been anything on that score that's kind of been directed at you?
I mean, I really do wear different hats, although I do try to bring in the political science for my sort of public commentary. Some people on Twitter will be like, wow, your classes must be like so interesting. I really wish I could see that. But my classes aren't that interesting. I keep them not that interesting. I assign really, the typical readings and things. I don't do any political advocacy. I actually try to discourage my colleagues from doing political advocacy as well. For example, all the time I'm asked to join, open letters and things like that. So
Open letters are so obnoxious, aren't they?
They're so annoying. There's nothing more annoying than an open letter. So in any event, yeah, the max that you're seeing isn't really the one that occupies my office at Northeastern.
Oh God, there was like a never-ending torrent of open letters during the election, and the only function of them was to make the signatories feel as if they did something noteworthy. They never did. They had no effect other than that.
That they're always so superficial. They're almost always cost-free. They're basically told by the majority to the minority, at least in the sort of intellectual class. And furthermore, the letters themselves tend to be cited as like ipso facto evidence of being correct, when in fact no evidence is presented in the letter, and all you're pointing to is the fact that these signatories have signed their name.
It's pure credentialism. It's
yeah. So in a way, there's nothing more anti-intellectual than an open letter, because what it says is basically, how could you disagree with all of these enlightened people? Let's not actually talk about the details.
I know it was so annoying. Hopefully that practice has fallen out of favor, but I kind of doubt it. Okay, well, this was a wonderful discussion, and thank you for having it.
All right, thanks, man. Let's be in touch.
Absolutely. Take care.